Pistorius, I met him. He was initially very meek, very sort of soft voice, very, very polite to me. But it was funny because quickly he sort of changed and he adopted a attitude towards me as if we were sort of old buddies. And he said, "Fancy an Italian." And off we went in his car to a nearby Italian restaurant, which he told me had been a favorite, not only of his, but of his girlfriend, Riva, the person he murdered. We had a sort of fairly kind of stress-free lunch in which he talked mostly about the food, recalling the dishes, the linguine, I remember in particular, that Riva Steenkamp liked. Then we went back to his home, to his cottage within the grounds of his uncle's home, and that's when the what had already been a very weird scene became rather spooky, because the first thing I saw when I went in was hanging up on a wall above a mantelpiece a framed photograph of Riva Steenkamp looking bewitchingly beautiful in a sort of classic model pose, and underneath the photograph on the mantelpiece, a lit candle.
Oscar Pistorius, the Paralympian, has been released on parole from prison in South Africa, nearly 11 years after murdering his girlfriend, Riva Steenkamp. Officials have confirmed that Pistorius is now at home, having served half of his sentence. He'll have to live under strict conditions and constant supervision until his sentence ends in 2029. Let's speak to John Carlin. He is author of Chase Your Shadow, The Trials of Oscar Pistorius. Morning to you.
Hi, good morning.
Now, this was a man who was at the absolute height of his fame. He looked like he had got just the world at his feet, as had Riva Steenkamp. She was an intelligent woman. She was a model. She was working to be a lawyer. And just remind us what happened, and indeed what Oscar Pistorius said happened, but what the court ruled.
Right. Well, what Oscar Pistorius happened was that it was, as he called it, a tragic accident, that he thought there was an intruder, an ill-intentioned intruder in his home, hiding in his bathroom, and therefore he shot 4 bullets through the bathroom door, killing the person he thought was an intruder. But upon opening the door, he discovered it was his girlfriend, Riva Steenkamp. As for what the courts have ruled, initially in the first trial, the murder trial, the judge, a black lady called Thokozile Masipa, found that he was guilty of culpable homicide, what we call manslaughter. In other words, that he didn't have the intention to kill. But an appeals court, presided over by 5 judges, then ruled that she had been wrong, that he had indeed committed murder in the sense that he had intended to kill, necessarily intended to kill by firing those 4 bullets through a door, knowing there was a person on the other side. What no court has been able to establish, the prosecution certainly tried to do so in the original trial, but what no court has been able to establish is that he deliberately, knowingly killed Riva Steenkamp.
Now, I know that you've met Oscar Pistorius and his family. Just give us a bit of an insight into the man.
Well, yeah, I mean, during the trial, I was the only journalist who spent any time with him. I was doing my book about him. I got to know his family quite well. And I met him at the place where I believe he's gone now, immediately following his release, the home of his wealthy uncle Arnold, which is like a sort of castle. It's like a fortified building with literally a moat around it. And within the grounds of this vast property of his uncle's, there's a cottage in which Pistorius was staying during the trial, and to which I suspect he's going to return to live now, at least for a while. Pistorius, I met him. He was initially very meek, very sort of soft voice, very, very polite to me. But it was funny because quickly he sort of changed and he adopted a attitude towards me as if we were sort of old buddies. And he said, "Fancy an Italian." And off we went in his car to a nearby Italian restaurant, which he told me had been a favorite, not only of his, but of his girlfriend, Riva, the person he murdered. We had a sort of fairly kind of stress-free lunch in which he talked mostly about the food, recalling the dishes, the linguine, I remember in particular, that Riva Steenkamp liked. Then we went back to his home, to his cottage within the grounds of his uncle's home, and that's when the what had already been a very weird scene became rather spooky, because the first thing I saw when I went in was hanging up on a wall above a mantelpiece, a framed photograph of Riva Steenkamp looking bewitchingly beautiful in a sort of model, classic model pose, and underneath the photograph on the mantelpiece, a lit candle. We didn't reflect too much on this. Then he proceeded to sit down on a couch with me and show me an album of photographs of him and Riva smiling together, posing for the cameras, looking very much in love. And I think that his purpose was to try and convince me that there's no way that he could possibly have deliberately killed this woman whom he said to me, and he said before the trial judge, that he loved deeply and indeed wanted to set up home with and marry.
Wow, really interesting insight. What do we know about his time in prison and indeed what he's like now? I was reading, it's been reported that far from being the elite athlete he was, he's now become bloated. He's started smoking.
Look, I can't tell you about that. I mean, I did this book some time ago at the time of the trial. I mean, I've read what you've read, but I mean, I'll tell you what we can say absolutely for certain that he's not going to go back to becoming a full-time athlete, to being, you know, a Paralympic runner or any other kind of runner. He's clearly going to be a shadow of the man that he was, and I suspect that he's going to shun the bright lights from now on. Previously, he sought them. Now he's going to shun them. He retreated into himself. I think by law, he's not allowed to give interviews to the media. So he's not going to be sort of parading around the world telling us his story. And my piece of speculation, and it's pure speculation, is that he's going to maybe try and atone for what he did by perhaps helping out landmine victims in Angola and Mozambique. It's a suggestion that was put to me by his uncle many years ago. Or perhaps he'll just help young Paralympic athletes. But I think he's definitely going to keep a low profile. He's very, very, very much the fallen hero.
Was he worried about his own personal safety? We were speaking to our correspondent in South Africa earlier on, and she was talking about, you know, potential dangers to him because he is such a divisive figure in South Africa, people having very strong views on him. Was he ever aware of a security issue? Did he ever feel threatened?
You mean back then, at the time of the killing?
when you were speaking to him? I mean, we know there were attacks in prison, weren't there?
Yeah. Look, I know South Africa extremely well. I lived there for many years. And South Africa is a country where if you're not paranoid about crime, you're not getting it. You know, it's a very dangerous place, a very, very high murder rate, an awfully high number of burglaries, home invasions. And, you know, he was a high profile guy. He had mixed, it was known among certain circles of people who belonged to what are sort of, you know, loosely called mafias in South Africa. He apparently had some enemies within that world. So it is definitely entirely plausible to believe that you know, he was in a state of high alert, and his story that he believed it was an intruder in his bathroom, and, you know, someone who might merit being shot at, which is a very extreme thing to say, but is a scenario which is more plausible in South Africa, shall we say, than in Britain or many other countries, because there is an incredibly high crime rate in South Africa.
Did you believe him?
No, I mean, I find it impossible to reach, you know, a clear judgment on this, and I think it's impossible for anybody to do so. I mean, for me, the most intriguing thing about this whole case, at least at a sort of broader sociological level, is the number of people, and I mean millions, who followed this around the world, both the story when it broke and the trial, which was broadcast live on TV. I'm amazed by the millions who have the absolute conviction either that it was indeed a tragic error, as he said, or that you know, he had deliberately killed it. And the majority view, according to statistics of social media, is that he did indeed kill her. Now, I myself, having followed this incredibly closely, I traveled to many countries, spoke to many people who knew him very closely, followed the trial day by day. I cannot, you know, in all honesty, declare what I believe happened there, because there were no eyewitnesses. And so it is fascinating to me how people seize on, I think, a sort of a narrative that we have in people's minds, a kind of Othello Desdemona, a sort of, jealous lover narrative, which was one that sort of gripped most people and created this firm conviction in people's minds about something that they cannot possibly know the details of.
The lawyer representing Riva Steenkamp's family, Tanya Cohen, has been speaking this morning. She's reacted to the parole decision on Sky News.
He's always maintained that it's an intruder. June and Barry have always said that they believe the witnesses heard an argument and then the shots. So they've never believed Oscar's version. And that is why June, at the parole hearing recently, in her victim impact statement, stated that she still doesn't believe his version, neither did Barry. They didn't believe that he is rehabilitated and because of that, not properly remorseful.
Well, that is Tanya Cohen, who is a lawyer representing the Steenkamp family. John Carlin, thank you so much for speaking to us this morning.
My pleasure.
Really fascinating to get your insight. John Carlin there, who's author of Chase Your Shadow, the trial of Oscar Pistorius, who has this morning been released from prison halfway through his sentence. He'll have to live under strict conditions, things like you can't speak to the media, he won't be able to take alcohol or any drugs, and he'll have to be at that house, his uncle's home, for specific times of the day.